Hello everyone. Welcome to the Care Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future conference. My name is Sue Yeandle. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Sheffield, and I'm also Director of the Sustainable Care Programme, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm also Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Care and Caring. It's my pleasure to introduce this session in our theme on caring relations towards sustainable arrangements with wellbeing outcomes. And today's session is focused on concepts and caring democracy. I'm delighted to say that we have 4 speakers who are going to speak about their own research on different aspects of this broader theme. And we will then have a discussant, Tom Hunt, who I will introduce before he makes his remarks. So without more ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker, who is Lizzie Ward. Lizzie is Principal Research Fellow in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Brighton. And Lizzie is going to talk to us about care ethics, older people self-funding their care, and relationality in the UK. Welcome to this session, Lizzie.
Thank you, Sue. So hello everybody, I'm Lizzie Ward, as Sue said, from the University of Brighton, and I'm going to be talking about knowledge about care and what we can learn from listening to older people's experiences of paying for their own social care. So the presentation draws on some research which was carried out in partnership with my colleagues, Professor Mo Ray at the University of Lincoln and Dr. Denise at the University of Brighton, and it was funded by the Wellcome Trust. So can we have the first slide, please? Okay, so to start with some background about the research, it was carried out in 3 sites, so that's Brighton and Hove, Lincolnshire and Solihull. And in each research site, we had a team of academic researchers working alongside older people as co-researchers, and our approach was grounded in co-production. So that was all about bringing different types of knowledge together. So alongside our older co-researchers who had lived experiences, we also had practitioner knowledge by working with our community partners who were Age UK Solihull, Age UK Brighton and Hove, and Evergreen Community Trust in Lincolnshire. And we also worked with a range of social care stakeholders, so that was care providers and practitioners from the statutory sector, voluntary sector and independent sector. And they formed part of knowledge exchange groups, which met with us 6 times in each site over the course of the project. And those meetings, those knowledge exchange meetings, were really about discussing the themes that emerged from the research. So bringing those perspectives as well into discussions, and that really helped us contextualise the data and generate hopefully a deeper understanding of the issues as they emerged. So it was a qualitative study and it had 3 data streams. Mainly the first stream was actually older people who are funding their own care. But we also spoke to unpaid carers, so they were family members and friends who were supporting an older person who was paying for their own care. And then we had a stream of stakeholders who were social care professionals, and these included local authority commissioners, care providers, practitioners and care workers. So we collected the data during 2018 to the beginning of 2020, and we just finished data collection when the pandemic started. And with the support of our funders, we were able to go back to a small subsample of participants and do some telephone interviews, and that helped us produce what we've called a postscript to the main data. For today, though, the presentation today is going to focus on the data from the older people's stream, so older people who are self-funding. Next slide, please. So Our commitment really is to recognising the value of knowledge that's generated from lived experiences of ageing. And this actually links to how we've been thinking about care and our conceptual framework, which is based in care ethics. So conceptually, care ethics is a way of thinking about the centrality of care for human life, and also thinking about the moral and political responsibilities for care. And it really opens up questions about how we organise care in society, but also questions related to social justice, inequality, power, and how we think about these in relation to care. So I think it gives us some conceptual resources to think differently about care. And Joan Tronto, leading care ethicist and also keynote speaker of this conference, in her work on care and democracy, one of the things she talks about is she asks, how can we make care more democratic so that responsibility for care are more equally spread and everyone's care needs can be met? And the problem, or one of the problems she identifies, is the way that the economic has come to dominate every aspect of human life. And she sees this as neoliberalism presenting possibly the biggest roadblock to actually achieving more democratic care. So thinking about this and how we respond to the challenge that Joan has set us, we want to focus on questions of knowledge about care. How knowledge about care is produced, what does it entail, and whose knowledge is it? So we start by highlighting some of the problematic aspects of knowledge produced within a neoliberal economic framework. And we can see this economic prioritisation in the audit and measurement culture which prevails in many areas of public services, including the management and delivery of care services through the time and task approach. We can also see it in the neoliberal economic assumptions about the primacy of choice and rational decision making, which has underpinned many of the policy approaches to care over the last few decades in the UK and in other places. And both of these things have a very negative impact on care as it is practiced within our social care system. So the experiences of giving and receiving care, because the starting point isn't the need for care or care needs. But we want to argue that they also limit what constitutes knowledge about care. The audit and measurement culture applied to the management of care provision seriously limits understanding about care, which ultimately fails to meet older people's care needs and address their wellbeing. So if knowledge about care is only based on objective, measurable frames of reference, the lived experiences of care are relegated to the realm of subjective preference, opinion, or anecdote. Can we have the next slide, please? And in our project, we set out to address the absence of older people's voices, and this has really been the driving force behind the project. So working with our older co-researchers, many of whom have had direct experience of finding and managing care themselves, we interviewed 65 older people who were self-funding their care 3 times over an 18-month period. They were aged between their early 60s and late 90s, but most of the participants were aged over the age of 80, and 16 were over the age of 90. And at the start of our study, all of the participants were living at home, but by the third interview, 6 had moved into residential care. They lived in a range of circumstances. Some were living with their spouse or partner, others were widowed and living alone. And in one site, we had quite a large proportion of women who had never married and of people who were ageing without children. So quite a diverse mix. Can we have the next slide, please? And as you can imagine, we generated a lot of data, but here we're just going to focus on one aspect and think about what we learnt about choice, as this is one of the widely held assumptions about self-funders, that they are able to choose the care that they're paying for. After all, they are paying for it, so the assumption is that they're able to make a choice about this. But this assumption didn't really match the reality for many of the older people in our study, where having a meaningful choice about care was limited by a number of factors. So firstly, making a choice implies having the time and ability to process information and weigh up options. Our participants often had to look for care in a crisis, and quite often as part of a hospital discharge process. So they really didn't have the time to contact several care providers or wait for them to call back or make exploratory visits. Instead, they had to make hasty decisions that often involved compromises to secure any care at short notice. So next, we can think about choice also depending on there being options to choose from. Our participants often found a lack of services where agencies just didn't have enough care workers in their area to take on new clients. And very often, providers couldn't accommodate the specific type of care needed or the timing of care needed. So that meant having a choice wasn't really meaningful. The lack of care services was particularly acute in some rural areas where people often paid a care premium to reflect the cost of petrol and travel time. This also meant for some participants, they were actually buying more care than they really needed just to secure a care visit, as carers had a minimum visit time to reflect that longer time to rural, travelling to rural locations. There was also a widespread lack of understanding about how to actually go about organising care, assessing what care services are needed, where to find these, who to trust, how much it will all cost. So in effect, people were really unprepared for being a consumer of care within a market system. At best, they may have been sent a list of care agencies, but they had no way of distinguishing between different care providers in terms of the services that were offered, their relative cost or their quality. One person described it as like trying to pick the winner of the Grand National. Can we have the next slide, please? So the experiences of the participants in our study illustrate some of the flaws in the underlying current assumptions of individual choice, which inform policy. But they also reveal that these same assumptions don't capture the nature of care in old age as it is experienced. Our participants talked about many aspects of their lives, such as loss and bereavement, identity, changing relationships, as well as health, which all formed part of the backdrop in which the care was being negotiated. Their stories illustrate changes in capacity and in their sense of identity and feelings about loss of independence and needing to accept care from others. All of these had to be encountered whilst also trying to work out how to resolve care needs through a market-based system of care. We can see that what apparently guides human behaviour according to the economic doctrine, maximising self-interest and making rational choices, bears very little relevance in this context. Our participants were dealing with far greater complexity. Not only was their capacity to choose bounded by their local social care market, but by their own circumstances, and their decisions about care were not just rational information-driven ones. So to shift the focus from the economic logic, we think means challenging the basis of knowledge about care. Where an audit culture prevails, an evaluation of care is based on performance indicators to produce intelligence about the care system. The experiences of people with care needs, who are on the receiving end of that system, will remain invisible. And if we are to think about and understand the meaning of care in old age, we really must engage with the complexity of lived experiences. The kinds of answers that a neoliberal framework provides are meaningless in this context. Listening to the lived experiences of those engaged in the daily struggles of giving and receiving care in a whole range of circumstances has the potential, we think, to challenge the neoliberal narrative about care. Last slide, please. And finally, just to emphasise that this was a collaborative project that involved many people, as you can see, and to acknowledge all of their contribution to this work as well. And you can find more information about the research, the report, and various briefings in our project on the project website, which is olderpeopleselffundingcare.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. That was a really interesting presentation, and I can tell from what you've said how important that study that you've done with your colleagues is going to be in really opening up some important avenues for public discussion about care, which we so greatly need in this country. So I thank you for that. And it also caused me to reflect on the fact that over the years, I've often been struck by how little opportunity older people have to give voice to their daily experience, and that how shocked I was when I first started looking into older people's lives and realised that actually we don't really have a great deal of information about them, and a lot of what happens to them is concealed and hidden. So I really welcome your new study, and I urge others to follow up and read your reports and look at the outputs that you've produced, and I thank you for your contribution. We're going to have the opportunity to discuss what you've said towards the end of our session, but I want to move on now to our next speaker, who is a close colleague of mine, Matthew Bennett, who is now a professorial research fellow at Circle at the University of Sheffield. And Matt is going to talk about some of the new evidence about unpaid carers, people who are providing care in an informal way, not as part of the paid and formal system that Liz has been describing. But I think this is going to give us another set of really interesting ideas about how we can understand more about care. So Matthew, welcome to the session, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Sue. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, just really excited to present some preliminary findings from the work that we've all been doing on the Sustainable Care Programme. So I've been leading on a work package for the last 3 years, looking at the costs and contributions of care, typically focusing on outcomes for unpaid carers, including economic and financial outcomes, but also health and wellbeing outcomes. And so this is some preliminary findings from some work that I've been doing in collaboration with Dr. Yanan Zhang, where we have been looking at the biological responses to unpaid care and looking at the nature of that care that they're doing, the care intensity, and the carer-care recipient relationship, and how that impacts on the health outcomes. Next slide, please. Great. So we have a number of research questions in this paper and in these preliminary findings. We want to really look to see if care is associated with objective physiological changes or objective physiological outcomes. And so we're interested in 3 elements of care. We're interested in whether the respondent or the people in the data care in the household, or if they care outside of the household, and the intensity of the care that they provide, and that's measured in terms of weekly hours, but also the relationship between the carer and the recipient of care. So whether they're the carer is caring for a child, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, or another relative, or somebody else entirely. And we're really sort of utilising a number of resources that are becoming more and more available across the social sciences, where people are starting to not only collect questionnaire responses, but they're also linking in biological data too. So the data set that we're going to be looking at today contains blood samples, and so we've used these blood samples to construct measures of something called allostatic load, which is the health outcome measure that I'm going to be looking at today. An allostatic load is wear and tear of the body when exposed to stressful situations. So it's typically a measure of chronic stress. So experiences of stress for a long period of time. It's widely used in medicine and the health sciences when studying physiological responses to stressors. And I've combined a number of biological analytes that capture cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroendocrine, and immune biomarkers. I'm going to be explaining a little bit more of that shortly. And next slide, please. So the relevance, just to contextualize this research in the wider literature. Some studies show that a small amount of caregiving has positive impacts for people for a number of reasons. It's associated with warm glow, approval, validation, lots of other things like that. But predominantly what you see in the literature is that unpaid caring does result in physiological and health outcomes, or negative physiological and health outcomes. So things like higher rates of mortality and a heart disease, for example. But relatively little is known about some of those biological responses, and also how these biological responses might explain some of those relationships, mortality rates, for example, in the data. And so I'm particularly interested in these biological responses and allostatic load, because I think caring may result in systematic stress and release cortisol as part of the stress response of the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, and other pro-inflammatory cytokines and inflammatory markers. So lots of sort of complex interactions that are happening biologically in the body. Next slide, please. So here's just a sort of brief schematic that describes the interaction between the physical environment and the human body. So stressors and stress can be sort of thought about in a number of different ways. So in terms of environmental stressors, so things to do with work and home life and neighbourhood characteristics, major life events, and also trauma and abuse. And individuals respond to these stresses in very different ways, and cope with these stresses in very different ways, and vary incredibly between individuals. So lots of individual differences help us explain how people cope with stress in terms of genetic characteristics, development and experience, but also behavioural responses to those stressors. So things like fight and flight, personal behaviours, diet, smoking, drinking, exercise, etc. And these interactions and these mechanisms result in physiological responses. People either adapt to the stress in positive ways or negative ways, and this is can be measured or this can be looked at in terms of allostatic load. Next slide, please. So here's just a schematic sort of outlining some of these complex interactions and the role of the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. So I won't go into too much detail here, but just to say that this is an important mechanism within the body that results or is responsible for stress responses and allostatic load. Next slide, please. So the data that I'm using come from the UK Household Longitudinal Study, which is commonly known as Understanding Society. I'm using wave 2 of the data, which is an individual level data source on the attitudes, preferences, and demographics of people. It's nationally representative of all people in the United Kingdom, and this wave is particularly important for the study because it includes a nurse visit where a blood sample was collected 5 months after the main survey was responded to by the respondents. Quite a large sample of people who agreed to this, depending on the biological analyte. slight measure of interest. We have between 7,387 respondents and just over 12,000 respondents. And I'm going to be using, I estimated these models a number of different ways, but the results that I'm showing today are Poisson regression analyses. Unfortunately, this is only a cross-sectional study. The biomarker sweep was only at one point in time. Most of the work that Yanan and I have been doing is longitudinal, using the panel element of the data, which follows nearly 50,000 people over time. So this is a smaller subset of that wider study. Next slide, please. So the key independent variables, the key characteristics of care that I'm interested in are the location of the care, so whether the caring happened in the household for a sick, disabled or person of old age, and caring outside the household for the same for the people with the same characteristics. Also interested in hours of care per week, or the intensity of care, and this was measured in the following way: 0 hours, 1 to 9 hours, 10 to 19 hours, 20 to 49 hours, and 50 plus hours. And then we measured the relationship between the carer and the person in receipt of care, in terms of whether the care was for a spouse, a parent, a child, a sibling, other relative, or somebody else entirely. Next slide, please. Great. And so here's our dependent variable, but here's our dependent variable, our outcome measure of interest. And so this is allostatic load, and so I used 12 biological analytes that was contained in the blood sample. And again, these captured cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroendocrine, and immune biomarkers, and one anthropometric measure too, which I'm going to describe in a bit more detail shortly. So this was a 12-point index, and I used clinical cut points for each measure. So these are cut points at which we know if somebody exceeds that level, they are experiencing chronic stress. So I combined all of these 0, 1 variables, one indicating that somebody has exceeded the clinical cut point, and I combined them all into one scale. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, this is a measure of physiological wear and tear, chronic stress response from the body. And next slide, please. Great. So here are the measures that we have in the data that we're looking at. So here you can see the type of analyte here on the left-hand side, where we have neuroendocrine, immune, metabolic, cardiovascular, and anthropometric measures. We have the name of the biomarker. So, for example, for the neuroendocrine biomarker, or sorry, type of measure, we have DHEAS, and this is a measure that's associated with cardiovascular health. For our immune biomarkers, we have C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, and IGF-1. And these are indicators associated with inflammatory load and heart disease. Our metabolic markers are HDL, total cholesterol, triglycerides, and HbA1c, which are all risk factors associated with diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And our cardiovascular measures were pulse rate, systemic blood pressure, and diastolic blood pressure. And then our last anthropometric measure was body mass index. And here on the far side of this slide, the far column, you can see those clinical cut points that were used for measuring chronic stress. Next slide, please. So these are obviously very sort of complex relationships that we're interested in. We're not only interested in the person's caring responsibilities and whether they're an unpaid carer, but we're also interested in these biological outcomes too. And both being a carer and our health outcomes are associated with lots and lots of different things that have occurred to us in our lives. And so what we do in these large sort of regression models is we need to factor in lots of controls and other explanations that help us understand caring and why somebody cares, but also the outcome variable, our measure of objective health. So I've included in these models, which I'm not presenting today, I've included as many of these explanations and factors that we think are associated with both the key independent variables and the dependent variable as possible. So for our background characteristics, I've included age, sex, ethnicity, education, marital status, health status, income, household size, children in the household, and the religiosity of the respondent. Subjective well-being, subjective general health, long-term disability or injury, diabetes, smoking, alcohol consumption, and heart problems of the respondent, and then a number of biological controls as well, which we think are specifically associated with our measure of allostatic load and the analytes. So the way the method of extracting the blood was controlled for, the length of time the blood was stored, the time of day the blood was drawn, whether the respondent had eaten in the last 30 minutes, and then a range of medications as well, which would be associated with biomarkers. So statins, aspirin, contraception or hormone replacement therapy, anti-epilepsy medication, and then an antifibrillonic medication too. Next slide, please. So here are our results. So just bear in mind that all of those controls I just described are also included in this model, but I just want to focus on the main elements of care. If we take the first set of coefficients, we have care location. So we have whether somebody's caring in the household or caring outside the household. And what we're looking for here is positive and negative numbers. A positive number tells us that that independent variable, or that factor, is positively related with our dependent variable. So it increases allostatic load, whereas a negative value tells us that it decreases allostatic load. And the stars in this table just indicate whether that is a statistically significant relationship. In other words, if we can be confident that that measure increases or decreases allostatic load. So in terms of this first model, we can see that we have one statistically significant relationship. It looks like caring in the household is positively related with allostatic load. In other words, being a carer in a household, being an unpaid carer in a household, is associated with higher levels of allostatic load. In terms of our caring hours variable, we've included these as a range of categorical variables. We can see that the numbers get bigger as the number of hours also increases, and we can see that the stars, first we have a cross and then a star and then 2 stars. This tells us that the relationship between the intensity of care and allostatic load gets more significant as the level of caring increases. So it looks like there's a kind of dosage effect here. The more care that, the higher the level of intensity of care, the bigger the impact is on allostatic load. So it increases allostatic load and that negative outcome. When we look at the relationship between the carer and the person in receipt of care, we can see that the only statistically significant relationship we have is whether or not that person is caring for a spouse. The other variables are not included here. Are not statistically significant. And then finally, there was no relationship between caring outside of the household and the relationship between the care receiver and the caregiver. Next slide, please. So this just really summarises those findings. Caring in the household was associated with high levels of chronic stress. There seemed to be a dosage effect of weekly caring intensity, where more hours of caregiving was associated with greater chronic stress, and caring in the household was the only thing that was associated with caring in the household for a spouse was the only thing that was associated with allostatic load with more chronic stress. Next slide, please. So very preliminary findings, lots of variables and interesting things that could be looked at in this data set. So we could look at sex differences and care trajectories over time. How long people have been caring for a respondent, for example, the condition of the care recipient, so whether what the precise disability, illness or condition is, to see how that impacts on stress. But we also the data are also geocoded too, so we can link people to their local neighbourhoods or their local authorities and capture information about that local authority too, and look to see how that impacts on the experience of care and health outcomes. We're also in a really sort of exciting time at the moment in terms of the data that are being collected. So these data are also there's also genetic information in this data set too. So that's a really sort of fantastic opportunity to enable us to decompose the variation in some of these health outcomes into genes and also sort of environmental factors too. So we can really look to see the complex interaction between nature and nurture. And I think there are some really exciting opportunities then to think about epigenetics, for example, how certain genes are turned on and turned off as a result of environmental stressors. But also just to briefly describe some of the work that I'm doing with Sue, with partners at the Office for National Statistics in the future. We've just started to link population register data. So we are linking the census records to healthcare and education and employment records to really help us understand how being an unpaid carer impacts on all sorts of things like diagnoses of new physical and mental health conditions, prescriptions, accessing services, so hospital admissions and readmissions, substance use, suicide and mortality. So it's a really exciting time, I think, for the Sustainable Care Programme and the work that we're all planning collaboratively in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you for sharing this incredibly exciting and very detailed, meticulous work that I know you and Yanan have been doing on this particular set of data. Some of these assets in our statistical system that you're using are some of the best in the world. So it's really important, I think, that we dig into these to get an understanding of what they mean for our knowledge about care and caring. Many of us will feel that intuitively we always knew that it was very stressful for people to care in the household for a spouse with a significant illness, and particularly to do so intensively and over time. But we know how important it is that we have robust data that demonstrates this in terms of policy making decisions about our health and care services. So I thank you for what you're doing and encourage you to do more of this really interesting work. So we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Patrick Hall. And Patrick is also a member of the Sustainable Care team, and I'm delighted to welcome him to make his presentation from his role at the University of Birmingham, where he's been working closely with Professor Catherine Needham, who's also part of our team. And Patrick's going to talk about the cyclical turn in UK social care policy with a question mark. And he's going to talk to us a bit about temporality, modernisation and community. So Patrick, over to you.
A huge thanks to Sue for that introduction, and a big thanks to the members of the Sustainable Care team who have made this session today possible. I know how hard they've been working, so thank you to Kelly and Dan in particular. I'd just like to start by stating what a privilege it is to be here with the accomplished speakers today. As an early career researcher, big thanks, as Sue mentioned, to Professor Catherine Needham, who's the lead author on this work. Next slide, please. I'm here today to discuss some emerging findings from the UK, so the Comparing UK Care Systems work package, which is part of the Sustainable Care Programme, in which we explore divergence in policy, discourse and decision-making in the UK's four national care systems since the devolution settlements at the end of the 1990s. Although I'll be discussing Scotland today, I won't yet be able to share findings as we're still completing field work. We've had a withdrawal of a few participants and case studies as a result of the coronavirus crisis, but we look forward to returning to Scotland soon to complete our field work, and that's a really exciting part of what's coming up. Next slide, please. I'm not an academic by background, so entering the programme from a policy and commissioning background, I began the study with a number of assumptions kind of regarding how we might approach this comparison. It seems, that the devolution settlements at the end of the 1990s presented us with an opportunity to compare the systems as they stand, compare their outcomes and make a judgment regarding their performance in a kind of natural experiment approach. But it turns out that it wasn't that simple, because there are a number of these big contextual differences. Next slide, please. So there are a number of different kind of big contextual and pre-devolution policy differences that make a kind of positivistic experimental comparison really difficult, including the kind of distinctive healthcare institutions that emerged in the four nations pre-devolution. Next slide, please. So you can see here some of the pre-devolution differences in not just adult social care, but social care departments across the four nations. Next slide. And so starting the project, I didn't really have much of a commitment to a research philosophy, and I've kind of made my way to one in preparation for a PhD to begin later this year, and with the guidance of Sue and other members of the team, including Professor Catherine Needham. So we've approached the comparison through a critical realist lens, which is theory-led and sensitive to context. The goal of our case studies is to examine some of the causal relations at play. In this case, the impact of the discourse of temporality and modernisation in a number of strategically chosen cases, rather than expecting regularities to occur wherever we were, whichever case we were looking at. Next slide, please. So ours is a multi-method study which begins with a historical and descriptive account of the emergence of the four systems over the past two decades. We've carried out around 70 interviews, some of which are, as I've mentioned, are inadmissible due to the withdrawal of participants. But by the end of the process, we should have completed around 100 semi-structured interviews with national stakeholders and local case study participants. Next slide, please. We use a form of abductive comparison. So we began with a flexible deductive approach, where we built our research instruments around exploring the concept of care regimes and the care regime literature. And that's kind of crudely the composition of care systems, the contribution of market forces, the state, community, and family, and thinking about systems in terms of their composition with regard to those contributory sectors. During the process of fieldwork and analysis, we've kind of come across other consistent themes from interviewees, which aren't part of that framework, which we've tried to recontextualize into theory for further analysis. And you can see here the content of some of those surprising emerging themes and the rough theoretical framework that we adopted. I'll discuss today some of our thinking about references in the data to modernisation and temporality, kind of where people talk about being behind the times, being modern, being up to date, or its opposite, really. Next slide, please. Of course, comparison between places and nations and systems has an implicitly temporal element. So when I talk to people about the project who maybe aren't academics, they say, who does it best? Where would you live? Which system does it best for disabled people or older people? Of course, my answer is always, it depends on who you are and where you are. But this theory of kind of progress, of a feeling of temporality, who's in kind of a spatial sense, embeds itself in the discussion of the role of families, market, and state. Next slide, please. And so I guess the question comes up then is kind of progress towards what? In classical accounts, of course, individual freedom appears as the goal of social change, and appears implicitly and explicitly in a lot of the liberal feminist framework around the socialization of care. So care as a block to the participation of women in working and public life. Next slide, please. Of course, there are voices which challenge this perspective of care. So, communitarians, care ethicists, such as Nell Noddings and Joan Tronto was mentioned. They've long highlighted the importance of kinship, community, and care, and the dangers of undermining the normative importance in modern societies for the provision of care. So the idea of modernisation with regard to social care is highly contested in theory, and we'd argue in the reality of discourse as it's discussed in adult social care policy systems. Next slide, please. There have been significant studies into what modernisation means in adult social care practice in the UK. This was a large study which was led by Caroline Glendigging, which we draw on. It claims that while the discourse of modernisation permeates the policy language throughout the various iterations of policy in England and Wales, it's not really a coherent programme. And largely our findings confirm this view. Next slide, please. So the study claims that the nature of social care in the UK means that there are several levels at which the modernisation discourse plays out. And the structure and characteristics of social care in the UK has an important implication for the way that modernisation is understood. And the characteristics are that there is a blurred private-public boundary in adult social care. There is a hugely fragmented delivery mechanism for adult social care, and care recipients and users contribute to their own care. It's a relational process, as care ethicists would also point out. Next slide. So modernisation can't just be characterised as a top-down change in managerial approach, as service provision is largely not public or narrowly within the range of state control. In fact, a large majority of adult care is carried out informally and unpaid. It can't be characterized simply as a process of marketisation, as care services are not and have not largely been state delivered, which seems to me to be a precondition for the idea of privatisation. And the same can be said for this concept of socialisation. Of course, these processes all play a part in this concept of modernisation. But modernisation can't just simply be reduced to one or the other of them. Next slide, please. References to modernisation in our study cover all of these processes, in fact, and interestingly, going in both directions. So here in Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland is described as being behind the rest of the UK because it has lower geographical mobility. And next slide, please. The same participant then describes this process in a light where it is seen as an advantage. And this is where the reference to a cyclical turn comes, is that, and this is a theme which comes up again and again in our research, people using a kind of cyclical metaphor, that perhaps the rest of the UK or other parts of the UK now emulate what might have been perceived as a lack of progress, which was earlier referred to. So the participant here states, perhaps we're coming full circle, where the value of that, so that's, you know, the maintenance of a sense of community, is actually starting to be perceived elsewhere. Perhaps we've avoided some of the mistakes that have been made. Next slide. So here in Wales, modernisation is, where modernisation might have be referred to in some places as the adoption of cooperative mechanism. Here it's referred to as an outdated approach. So an outdated traditional thinking, which is in fact presented as a modern approach in other parts of the discourse in Wales. Next slide, please. Here, a politician from England laments the socialisation and marketisation of care in England, and so we can see here again hints of that cyclical turn. Next slide. Interestingly, and what we think that we contribute to this theory of modernisation in adult social care is that there's a local dimension to this discourse. Here you can see a local politician describing national policy as missing the key local task of modernisation, or perhaps holding it back. Next slide. And here describing the act of modernisation as something which is forced on local government because of austerity pressures. So here modernisation is presented as an adaptation to something of a national abandonment. Next slide. So we can see the various ways in which policy actors utilise the discourse of modernity to describe movement in various directions related to the public-private barrier, the decline and reconstitution of community, both institutionalisation and deinstitutionalisation, towards localisation and nationalisation, all being described as modern. Next slide. So our findings reflect the broad direction of established theory on modernisation in adult social care, but we hope to develop it by adding a local dimension to this this play out of power in discourse. And my final slide, please. Is that it? I think I've changed my slides, but so interestingly, we think there's a local dimension to this discourse which is missing from the theoretical framework, which we hope to develop further. Thanks for listening, and back to you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And again, I think this is a really important study. This attempt to see what we can learn from looking at the 4 different adult social care systems that are playing out in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is really significant. And I'm struck when you're speaking, Patrick, about the rhetoric that has been very dominant both in social work and in adult social care policy and in government-led initiatives around some key words has had kind of surface impact: dignity, independence, choice. We've heard these spoken about as the key values in the delivery of adult social care, and of course more latterly also well-being. But so often I think feel kind of it's just being in favour of virtue, and and wishing this is what it was like, but not actually making that progress towards it. And it takes me back in my thinking to some of what Lizzie was saying at the beginning about whose voices are being raised and heard, and what attention is being paid to those, and who is being silenced and ignored. And I think we've really seen that also in the experience of COVID. So I think there's a lot of work here to do to really unpack all of this complexity, but also to theorize it in ways that can help us find better solutions. So thank you for a very interesting presentation, and I'm delighted now to introduce our final speaker in this session before we move to Tom, who is our discussant, and that's to speak with Amy Horton. So Amy is a lecturer in economic geography at University College London, and she's going to talk to us about interdependence, about contested interpretations and experiments in alternative residential care, both in the UK and in the USA. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Amy has to say. I've heard Amy speak in the past, and I've read some of her work, which I know is really interesting. So welcome, Amy, and we turn over to you.
Thanks very much, Sue, and I'll echo Patrick's thanks to all of the people involved in organising and the rest of the panel for the talks, which I've really enjoyed. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss the dynamics of fragmentation that I think are working against relations of interdependence in the provision of care and support for older people, particularly in England and the US. So I'll then set out some of the different interpretations of interdependence that have been put forward by movements of care workers, older people, and others. And finally, I'll discuss some of the organisational, material, and cultural questions surrounding efforts to enact these relations of interdependence in how we meet our needs for care. Next slide, please. So interdependence is, of course, at the heart of ethics of care, which are premised on a social conception of the self that's created and maintained through relationships. And these relationships range across scale from our immediate embodied reliance on others to global coexistence on a shared planet. Radical care ethics critique relationships where they fail or where they undermine care through irresponsibility and oppression, as disabled, feminist, queer, and post-colonial scholarship has explored. Next slide, please. However, the current organisation of care in many contexts complicates or undermines interdependence through various forms of fragmentation. Fragmentation can obscure lines of responsibility for inadequate provision, poor employment conditions, and the regressive distribution of resources. So I'm not trying to suggest that kind of centralisation and scaling up are necessarily the solution, but currently fragmented arrangements that are founded on individual consumers within a commercialised and often cost-cutting approach leave many people without care and require staff to work under extreme pressure. So to look at a few dimensions of this fragmentation, we know in England, responsibility for funding and governance of social care is split across private and public actors and different scales of government in ways that have permitted devolved austerity and greater privatisation of responsibility rather than progressive redistribution and shared responsibility. Another form of fragmentation relates to how many care systems are characterised by complex employment relationships, reflecting those fragmented funding arrangements. So carers often work in multiple places and through agencies. Poor conditions contribute to high staff turnover, and these forms of fragmentation can undermine relationships between staff and service users that are important to care. They also make it harder for care workers to engage in effective collective bargaining with a specific employer or decision maker, and that can promote exploitative working conditions. And then thirdly, over the past 2 to 3 decades, ownership of care homes in the UK, for example, has shifted from the public sector and small-scale private companies towards large private chains. And these have typically been owned by investment funds, such as private equity firms, And so we see this process of fragmentation where those investors seek to isolate the most profitable parts of the care business as the basis for loans or value extraction or sale. And we've seen this, for example, with the separation of the more profitable care homes within the Four Seasons portfolio into the brighter kind brand that was geared at residents paying for their own care, or with the splitting of companies' property assets away from the care operating company in order to release capital to investors. Or also with the kind of complex corporate structures, including the use of tax havens that have become quite common among these big chains. So such forms of fragmentation distribute gains to investors while tending to intensify labour and risk for staff and residents. Next slide, please. So against this, various actors have sought to assert interdependence in place of fragmentation. I now want to draw out some of the different interpretations that have been mobilised by unions and community organisations in the UK and particularly in the US. So these are groups that are seeking to ensure that care is valued more highly. So to start with, one interpretation of interdependence is primarily economic, and it focuses on the value generated by care workers, including indirectly throughout the economy by enabling other work. So we've seen this put forward by movements of domestic workers, including home care workers in the US, who say things like, "You're dependent on me for my service, I'm dependent on you to be compensated for that service." Or more broadly in their slogan that domestic work is the work that makes all other work possible, by freeing their clients to do other labour or the relatives of their clients. So these organisers have called on audiences to imagine New York City's 200,000 domestic workers going on strike. And this kind of economic framing of interdependence resists familial accounts of care and challenges the low value and maldistribution of care work, including the non-recognition of immigrant workers. So this perspective brings class and its intersections with race into analysis of the uneven distribution of caring labour. And I think it's closest to theories of social reproduction that identify the dependence of capitalist production on the unpaid or underpaid labour that sustains the workforce in general. This interpretation highlights the foundational nature of caring labour in the economy, and that's the justification for greater respect, recognition and remuneration, instead of kind of how care is currently treated, relegated as a sort of residual economic activity or a family responsibility. But by emphasising the instrumental purpose of this work within the economy, narratives of economic interdependence may cast the need for care as a burden on the rest of society. And the emotional aspect of effective labour, of the effective labour of care, is marginalised. So, for example, Silvia Federici has argued that the political potential of the concept of social reproduction has nothing to do with its affective dimension, and it's only about the economic power of these processes. So I think the risk here is neglecting the role of emotion and relationships in potentially inspiring and sustaining political mobilisation to assert relations of interdependence and the value of care. Next slide, please. So another approach to interdependence emphasises political responsibility, and that's the responsibility for us to take collective action to provide care and the resources that it requires. So rather than care being seen as an obligation, this kind of collective action can offer us a sense of empowerment. And as one organizer in a US group put it, most people are not the 97-year-old mountain biker. It's like, I need help getting dressed every morning, and these stories make me feel like I'm doing something wrong. So instead, this story of political mobilization makes me feel empowered, like, oh right, I'm part of something bigger. Or another example comes from the domestic worker movement's challenge to the racialized exclusion of domestic workers from labor protections in the US. And their narrative has drawn a powerful link between slavery and the contemporary treatment of women of colour, interpreting the modern movement as part of the continuing struggle for civil rights. So in a sense, this resonates with arguments that taking action at different scales to guarantee care must be understood as fundamental to democracy, since care is essential to equality. But some of my critiques of Toronto's account in Caring Democracy are the kind of focus on the scale of the nation state. And I'd argue for a radical ethics of care that takes a more geographically expansive approach, recognising the extensive reach of global care chains and other forms of global interdependence. In addition, where Toronto suggests that concerns with distribution should be replaced by attention to how caring responsibilities are allocated. So she says kind of it's a question of who does what rather than who gets what. I'd argue that we need to keep both the division of labour and those material dimensions together in our analysis. Next slide, please. And then a third interpretation of interdependence that kind of I identified in these discourses from the groups was focus more on relationships. And some political philosophers have relied not on abstract theories of moral obligation to justify the importance of care, but just referred to actually existing caring relationships. And these relationships can generate mutual well-being more effectively than institutionalized impersonal forms of care, although obviously it's complicated. And one participant in a workshop convened by US Advocates for Care recounted just taking her mother for a trip from her nursing home to a swimming pool. And she talked about the kind of hassle and discomfort of the journey on this hot day. But eventually they got settled next to the pool, and she said her mum's cheeks glowed pink in a way that they never did in the nursing home. And her mum really thrived on that day. She could give up her regular pain medication, and it was therefore the kind of best possible day for the whole family. But relational interdependence can also exceed the familial scale and recast these relations outside the terms of duty and mutuality. Highlighting emotional relationships goes beyond a negative view of care as defending biological survival and preventing suffering, or of reciprocity as repaying social debts. And instead it encourages an appreciation of relationships as contributing to the well-being of all parties in ways that are more creative and empowering than bureaucratic infrastructures where there's sufficient support available. In doing so, it breaks down the kind of active-passive binary of caregivers and recipients, and it values the emotional labour that's often marginalised by the technical skills that tend to get prioritised in processes of professionalisation. So looking at these different interpretations, I'd argue that we need to consider these different dimensions, economic, political, and relational, together in examining how care is organised. Next slide, please. So how can care be organised in ways that promote this expansive understanding of interdependence rather than uncaring fragmentation? So before I go into this, I just want to acknowledge the kind of debate around whether and to what extent dedicated spaces are needed for care and support. So on the one hand, people like Hilary Cottam have advocated infrastructure light and relationship heavy forms of care that are integrated into people's homes and other spaces. But on the other hand, some insist that a sort of degree of institutional nursing care is necessary for people with complex needs, and have raised concerns about the closure of publicly run care homes and day centres under the influence of austerity. And we certainly see investors continuing to put money into these kind of spaces of care, so they see it as important into the future. So I'm currently reviewing the literature on various approaches to creating more democratic caring infrastructures as alternatives to austere bureaucratic interventions. And these alternatives are often guided by principles of independent living and person-centered care. So in the discussion, I'd really welcome suggestions of reading or examples or details of ongoing research that you know of. So some key approaches to kind of providing and controlling resources in the literature are shown on this kind of, figure on the slide. So one area of interest has been cooperatives, so whether they are owned by employees or multi-stakeholder, including people using care services. And these can be developed through processes of co-production, where people play an active role in producing public goods and services of consequence to them, as Eleanor Ostrom put it. And we can also see co-production in other forms of ownership, of course. So one of those would be in remunicipalization, which I know some people are studying in the care context. So across all of these different forms, we see questions about sourcing and controlling resources, and particularly capital costs if space is needed. So where do we get those upfront resources from? Should the land and capital come from public funding or from private investment, perhaps ethical investors, or should it be held by the community through, for example, community land trusts? Next slide, please. So in addition to those questions about the kind of organisational form, I think there's important questions about where and why those forms can develop and thrive. And there's obviously kind of specific ideological, scalar and fiscal politics at work when we look at the kind of variations in care across just the UK. But across most of England, that model of austerity, privatisation and financialisation has proven quite deeply entrenched in many ways. And I think that reflects the constrained agency of many stakeholders. So we know care workers tend to face kind of undervaluing and those problems of fragmentation that I ran through when it comes to asserting their interests. And as Lizzie described, lots of people using care services are also kind of contending with impairments and crises. So ethics of care prompt us to recognise how our agency is always constrained, and I think instead we need to kind of work on developing this collective, interdependent form of agency. And one actor that has been seeking to do that is this kind of group in the US, Caring Across Generations, which brings together groups of older people and disabled people, domestic worker groups and unions and other community organisations. And they've been aiming to create a shared identity of the caring majority, in which people of all ages self-identify as caregivers or potential caregivers, and people involved in care in different ways. So by mobilising people on the basis of their caring identities and concerns with workers' rights, this can encourage a more distributed form of agency that aligns with care ethics and brings in different forms of power. So not only has this group successfully contributed to policy reforms, they've also cultivated and disseminated stories of care that express interdependence, like some of those I mentioned briefly before. And I think these can help to rework a lot of the negative emotions and affects that commonly surround aging, care and dying. So to conclude, I think we need to consider these cultural aspects, the political context, and all of the sort of organisational questions in creating democratic forms of care that are conducive to relations of interdependence. So thank you. Back to Sue.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was really thought-provoking and a very important contribution, I think. And I know, how complicated this field is and how many currents of thought there are which are attractive and seem, potentially productive in addressing some of the huge problems that modern societies face in having good care arrangements for all. But I think you're really, honing in on some of the really significant elements there, and I would encourage you to and others to debate the ideas that you're talking about. For me, there's a real agenda that we have to see is perhaps underscored by the current pandemic moment, around mobilising to enable and support good care and good care work, as well as the good experiences of providing care as well as of receiving it. And to me, this is a profoundly complicated and difficult problem, which is the more difficult because in our societies in the 21st century, some care is provided for people who have really complex disabilities and really profound and unpredictable needs. And I think those are things where we need to think about the role of the state, what we're doing with private provision, why we think it's a good idea to commercialise and to develop some of the aspects of the market that are growing quite fast or are changing quite fast, and there's a lot of mobility and variation in the market. So I welcome and thank you for a really thought-provoking contribution. I'd like to encourage all of the speakers that we've just heard to think about each other's presentations now while we turn to Tom, who's our discussant in this session and who's going to give his reflections on the presentations that we've just heard. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks very much to Lizzie, Matt, Patrick and Amy for 4 fantastic presentations. I wanted to start by posing a couple of questions that struck me as ways in which we might link together the 4 papers with one of the themes of this strand of the conference, which is that of the care democracy. And those questions are, whose views count and who gets heard? And these, I think, might usefully steer some of the discussion we can have. So first we hear from Lizzie, whose research informs us that, amongst other things, about the importance of listening to older people's experiences of their self-funded care. She showed the need to challenge and interrogate some of the dominant knowledge frameworks that shape how care is understood and implemented, time and task, and choice. Choice, as Lizzie showed, is assumed to be part of a framework in which objective, rational actors presented with full information and a range of choices to choose from, and in a time frame when they can consider all options, can make decisions about their care which are best suited to them and which we would assume are chosen to maximise their well-being. Now, just saying those words out loud exposes how idealised and unreal this picture is from the messy, complicated reality of life, where there's severe asymmetries of information, when decisions need to be made quickly, and when often there's a lack of choice, as the research shows. So how might this framework be challenged and changed? Well, as we heard, if it is to be, then listening to the lived experiences of those who self-fund care is going to be critical, which is a point that I think we might also draw out from the findings in Matt's paper. He presented powerful evidence showing how chronic stress is associated with caring within the household. Over time, the impact of the stressors described in the paper can severely harm the physical and mental well-being of carers, described as Matt in a powerful but kind of grimly mundane phrase as wear and tear on the body. So linking back to Lizzie's paper, do we think that stressed people who provide care at home can make good decisions, or do make good decisions, about current and future care arrangements, and more generally about their everyday circumstances? Taking a step back from the care context, do stressed people think rationally? I don't know about you, but when I have a long, stressful and tiring week, I'm barely able to decide what I want for tea that night, let alone think about making complex decisions affecting my future and the future of loved ones, whether that's a sole or joint decision. So in a care context that can lead to long-term chronic stress, that's hardly an ideal situation in which choices might be rationally considered and decisions made. Matt's research also invites us to think about the stress being placed, I think, upon paid care workers and also those receiving care. If one person in a care relationship is stressed, then we might assume that other people involved are likely to be experiencing stress too. If the harmful effects upon carers that Matt outlines are to be prevented, then I would suggest that an essential factor is, again, to go back to listening to the lived experiences of those who are in this situation and putting them at the centre of our thinking. And if this isn't happening, why not? Is it that we as a society and as researchers perhaps aren't asking? Or is it that the wrong questions are being asked? Or are there other reasons? And Matt's research may tell us where some of those data gaps are and how this could be addressed. And so if we do think that listening to lived experiences of those receiving and providing care is important, then it begs the question of who is listening and what conversations might that be part of. We can perhaps come back to that, but implicit in the idea of listening is that it's relational. It's not individualized, but a shared, mutual, in some form, collective process, just as we know care is. But as the presentations show in different ways, there's often a framework of individualism that can have a powerful influence over shaping care arrangements. Why? Well, part of the answer may very well come from the findings presented by Patrick, whose research asks us to reflect on modernisation. Now, this is characterised, modernisation, as Patrick highlighted, as a process of moving forwards and the displacement of what's come before. And it's also associated with notions of progress. Now, this seems highly relevant in the current moment here in England, when we're promised that reforms of adult social care are on the way again. It was the idea of progress and how it's bound up with modernisation that raised for me some interesting questions that we might want to discuss. When it comes to policy reform, but perhaps more commonly political reform and debate, progress and progressivism are strongly associated with the left. Progress is seen intrinsically as a good thing. Moving forwards, a better tomorrow, the inescapable march of progress. Yet, as Patrick said, progress to what is often not clearly articulated. And now what this forward march idea perhaps ought to call to mind is a concept associated more with the political right, that of TINA, or there is no alternative. A concept that, by its very nature, denies agency to people who are involved in or affected by whatever it is that's being advanced in the name of progress or modernisation and TINA. Again, this underscored to me when I was listening to the presentations the need for lived experiences to be central to our conception of care and to the idea of a care democracy, to the concepts we use in our research, and also how we might think about future changes to care arrangements. However many user forums or participatory panels or consultations that are held, are such efforts to listen to people fundamentally undermined if any changes that are being considered are described in terms of modernisation or progress? Might this lead to people thinking that it's a done deal and that actually their voices don't count? The other thought that modernisation called to mind is the motto often assumed with Mark Zuckerberg for how Facebook would run when he set it up back in 2004, which is move fast and break things. This was adopted not just by Facebook, but by other companies who sought to disrupt, like Tesla, but perhaps more relevantly by care, perhaps more relevantly for care, I should say, Uber, who flagrantly ignored labour law for a decade before finally the courts are beginning to catch up with them and seeking to repair some of the damage done. Yet Uber's new proposal to pay drivers the minimum wage for just the time between when they accept a job and drop a passenger off is very similar to only paying care workers for appointment time and not the travel time in between. So perhaps care scholars should be the ones putting the dampeners down on the idea that the issue of labour rights in the gig economy is somehow being resolved for the better. But by the time things have moved on and chickens come home to roost, whether that's in the context of Facebook or Uber or quickly introduced new care reforms, what long-lasting damage and fragmentation may have been done and at what cost? Which I think leads us to the concept of interdependence that Amy's presentation reflected on. Interdependence comes with responsibility. We don't live our lives solely through the logic of transaction. We support each other and are supported by others. To have a social conception of the self requires a duty of care to others to be taken seriously, and that means not going fast, but listening, evaluating, coming together, treating others as we would like to be treated. As Amy says, how can we organise care in ways that promote this expansive understanding of interdependence rather than uncaring fragmentation? And to me, again, this links us back to the idea of lived experiences and putting them at the centre of the debate. And by doing so, we can come back to the questions I began with, which is whose views count and who is being heard? Or perhaps to turn it around, who currently isn't being heard, and does that mean they don't count? If we think about democracy and set aside for a moment the formal institutions like parliament and elections, then the hallmarks of a democracy are the right to equal participation, respect, dignity, shared values. All of the presentations in different ways highlight challenges relating to care that suggests that these democratic values in different ways are currently lacking from discussion about our care arrangements. With care reforms coming down the track again here and elsewhere around the world, how might we encourage these values to be part of the reform process? What do these findings that we've heard about today mean for our concept of a care democracy? That, I hope, provides a few thoughts that we might now discuss. And thanks to all the four speakers for four fantastic presentations and for your important research. So, Sue, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and apologies for not mentioning at the beginning that you're the Deputy Director of the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute, and the thoughts that you've raised from a political economy perspective, I think, are really important, and I hope will stimulate the discussion we're now going to have. Questions in my mind are not only the ones you've specifically mentioned, which were about, whose views count, who is getting heard, but also, to my mind, are we getting anything right? Is the question I think we should be asking, because to use a commonly mentioned metaphor, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I do think we have made some progress over decades in understanding care and caring, understanding the lives of carers, understanding a bit more about the lives of older people. And certainly I think we've got more data than we had some years ago about what it's like to be a care worker and why people value the work of care that they do often, even though they do so in very difficult conditions. So is anyone listening? Are we getting things right? And can we do better? And I think lots of people involved in caring would say, we could do a lot better if you just let us. And if we could just arrange things so that that was possible. So I now want to invite everyone back into the room so that we can have a conversation about some of these points. And I think that you spoke very much initially, Tom, about whose views count. And I wondered if, Lizzie, you've got any reflections that stimulated perhaps by the other papers you've heard about, the ways we might ensure that the views of older and disabled people are more widely heard and can be made to count.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Yes, lots, probably too many ideas. I think as we were talking, I think one of the difficulties is this, the sort of status, if you like, of different kinds of knowledge and the who is listening. So on the one hand, it's like, well, who's being allowed to speak and how we enable that, but who are we talking to and who's listening? And I think Tom sort of picked up on this point as well, that Matt, your work is so detailed and complex and important. And Sue, you said, actually, if you speak to a carer, that pretty much actually could describe a lot of carers' lives. But I'm absolutely certain that the kind of work that you're doing will be taken on board by, say, policymakers in a way that the kind of work that I do around lived experiences isn't. And what is quite interesting that I've found while we've been doing this work, particularly around self-funding, is that wherever we've gone and whoever we've talked to, people respond to it by saying, I know exactly what you're talking about because I'm involved in the care of my parents or my auntie or whoever. People can make that personal connection at all kinds of levels, but they somehow, if it's a local authority commissioner, can separate their personal experience, and they might even say to you, it's so good to hear the lived experience because it allows me to step back. But then they step back in and carry on in the framework that they're more comfortable, their profession dictates, etc. So I think there's a real problem around getting different kinds of knowledges properly understood and acknowledged. And I guess that's some of what I was trying to do, is to question the sort of framework itself and the sort of epistemology and the philosophy and how we can kind of shift that and realise that, neoliberalism is a man-made set of ideas along with any other set of ideas. It isn't like oxygen, it can be changed and we can think about it differently. And I think that also connects to something you said, Sue, about public discussion, because I think at the moment the public discourse around care, and probably this will be a feature of the reforms that are coming, just always seem to focus on the funding aspect. And of course that's important. It is a big question. But how do we enable everybody to sort of think about care and the different elements of it? And I think part of the problem with that is also people are reluctant to do that. And I don't know if that's other people's experience.
Thanks. That's really helpful. No problem. Thank you for that. And to me, this is something that's really inspired some of what we've been trying to do in the Sustainable Care Programme, which is to think about well-being and quality of life across the piece, not just, of course, for care, for disabled people, for older people, but also for the people who are providing that care. Because I know, as Matt's paper shows, it's a source of stress, and I've fought against the idea that being a carer is burdensome, and I don't like the use of the language of burden, but which is widespread in academia, in particularly in analysis of unpaid care. And I think we all can see the stress that care workers are under very frequently. But actually, it's there are also lots of positives about care, as Matt's paper showed. Matt, do you want to come back on any of the points that Lizzie made, or to reflect at all on these different types of knowledge and the kind of ways we might weave some of them into public discussion?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks so much for your comments, Lizzie, and just your sort of kind words about the sort of the impactful nature of some of those sort of top line findings. I do think that it is incredibly shocking when you see things. When you see on a broader scale the impact that things that many of us, many people are experiencing. And this was just one study looking at people's stress responses at one point in time, but we've also done this more dynamically for subjective well-being and mental health, and we see similar patterns. We've done this for employment transitions and what the nature and intensity of care means for people moving from full-time to part-time work to completely out of the labour market. And unfortunately most people move completely out of the labour market before moving into part-time. And I guess I'm not sure I agree that with I think policymakers and politicians see those top level findings and they're shocked by them, and it hopefully it will sort of cause action and people to want to understand this a bit more, but what I can't do is understand the nature and the experiences of care. And we have these top level findings and what happens to people's levels of chronic stress and their mental health, but we really don't understand the experience of care, what this means to people's lives. And this is some of the work that we've been doing in the sustainable care program. I'm working with Carers UK, really sort of thinking about what this means for people and why, the mechanisms underlying some of these big general patterns. And that's why I think it's just so important to be working collaboratively and sort of filling in these evidence gaps together to paint a much more rich and meaningful picture of the impact that care has on people's lives. So that's, just something that I just wanted to reflect on and just sort of say is sort of fundamentally important to this work and to the work of sustainable care.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to come to Amy next, and then I'll ask Patrick to contribute as well. Amy, do you want to reflect on any aspects of that discussion or of the things that Tom raised?
Yeah, thank you. I was just really struck, Tom, by your question about kind of, do stressed people think rationally? So we hear that a lot in kind of discourses around international development, financial inclusion, dealing with poverty. And one of the ways that question gets answered is no. So let's remove the need for people to think by kind of nudging them to make good decisions within a narrowed framework. So, Lizzie, one policy response that I could imagine to your research is, people just need to be kind of given clear information about which is the best choice on this list, not just the phone numbers, but kind of the ratings, instead of what can we do to prevent people being stressed. And so I think, there's kind of real value in mixed method studies that combine the kind of powerful statistical findings that come from the really interesting research that you've been doing, Matt, and with the kind of what do people want as the changes in those contexts, Lizzie, which I think comes out of your study very strongly. So thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And Patrick, I know your background is in being involved in commissioning and organising care, and the daily battle that probably goes on in trying to keep the show on the road very often in delivering care within the frameworks that currently exist in the UK, in different parts of the UK. But how do you respond to this issue about how we hear what's happening and respond to it in ways which don't just batten it back down? I think Amy's made a really good point there, which is that the answer to the difficult issues which are raised by the points that Lizzie shared with us from her study is not to just make it more organised. So your perspective, Patrick?
Yeah, I think I've got two broad points, I guess, relating to both this idea about who to listen to and what do people want. I think the first point is that older and disabled people and people who are carers and care workers are not a single voice. They don't have a single homogenous voice. They are, like the rest of us, members of communities, people who live in places, who are influenced by tradition, by their families, by the communities in which they live. So I think it would be a mistake to kind of reach for an identitarian toolbox in order to listen to them. So by characterizing disabled people as having a perspective, or older people as having a perspective, or to kind of interpret those things through kind of narrow lenses of race, gender, and so on. I think the huge danger is that any listening exercise just kind of seeks to confirm the biases again of kind of younger, southern, more liberal people with regard to these hugely kind of contested concepts where people have really, really different perspectives. I was part of an interesting report recently by Demos, which uses a kind of a consultation software called Polis. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. It's called the Care Commitment, and they identify kind of two groups of opinion in England around these things, and they do kind of roughly reflect some of the big political divisions that have changed politics in this country. And I think, so the first group, kind of more likely to be female, more likely to have had interaction with social care, skew older, are more likely to be retired, less prevalent in London and the southeast, and make up a majority of people's perspectives on adult social care. And that's around reform of funding, about who should pay for what, who has responsibility towards whom. And the second group make up a smaller proportion of the population, less likely to have had interaction with social care, more likely to be younger, more likely to be in work, more prevalent in London and the southeast. So I think the challenge is to listen to both of those groups and to build a system which reflects the values of both of those groups, and to not have a kind of, a left behind in terms of adult social care policy. The second point I wanted to make is about neoliberalism. I think Lizzie makes a really interesting point there about neoliberalism being contested, and of course it is contested, but I think sometimes it's a mistake to kind of present the market fragmentation, marketization, choice and control, and all of these different kind of discourses as just emerging from a broader context of neoliberalism. In fact, I think that they have emerged from both this context of neoliberalism, but also from social movements of younger disabled people who wanted independence and wanted a diverse set of services which aren't just provided by the state in an institutional way. So I think it's important to recognize that kind of seemingly contradictory origin of some of the trends that we're seeing as well.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to invite Tom to make a few concluding comments from his perspective in a moment before we finish the session. But I want to also draw attention to the way care and support needs of individuals wax and wane across the life course, and how those shifting needs for support are another really challenging element of what's required. Because, as I'm sure Lizzie's study, she mentioned, had a repeat visit element to it, so that you're coming into contact with older people who were in different situations at different points in time, not particularly long apart, but over 6 months, if you're 95, is a long time. And in terms of what changes can happen, and we found this in work I've done with Kate Hamblin as well, really important element. And all of this adds to the complexity of response, because what people's feelings about autonomy and independence and wanting to just be looked after vary according to that state in life that they're in, and their sense of wanting to be empowered to do things or to be cared for when they're sad or scared or worried are different elements of the whole panoply of things which care is about. And I think it's that that wide range which is what makes me feel that Joan Tronto is right in many ways to say we've all got to be more involved. We've got to find a way of creating what Michael Fine wrote about a few years ago, which was creating a more caring society. And I think that it's bringing those things together would be really important. But Tom, you raised some issues. I don't know whether you want to add any further points, having heard what the speakers have had to say just a few moments ago.
Sure, thanks, Sue. I think I already had a sense of just how complicated this was, and how many ranges of different types of lived experience needed to inform our thinking on this. And the discussion in the last 5-10 minutes has just made me think it's a lot more complicated, complex, messy, and there's a lot more people whose voices do need to be heard than perhaps I thought. And I suppose a group that we haven't touched upon in terms of, but it strikes me it'd be good to have heard in this debate, are the people that we might think, at least on the face of it, are completely unconnected to the care system and to caring. Those who are younger, are not care providers, are in not needing to receive any care, and I think their voices in this are quite important. As society gets older, the generational kind of balance of people who are working versus not working is going to be an important thing for policymakers to consider. So that's one element. But I also think right now, in this moment coming out of the pandemic, it's a really important time to be having as wide a kind of society-wide discussion about care, to think about have attitudes towards how we might want people to be cared, and who is doing the caring shifted, or are they shifting as a result of what we've all gone through over the last year. There aren't many people who would publicly say, I don't support key workers right now. But, over the long term, what will that actually translate into? Are we really going to see a big shift in attitudes towards the fact that we know most care workers are receiving the national living wage, but not the real living wage? Are we going to accept that? Are we going to accept 15-minute care appointments? Are we going to accept people being paid not for their sleep-in time with people they're caring for? There's lots that I think could shift, and I think things like citizens' assemblies might inform our thinking on this. Ireland has used citizens' assemblies around the issue of very complicated issues like abortion to come to bring people together, and maybe on these kind of wicked problems around care, maybe things like that ought to be part of our thinking if we're going to put in place long-term sustainable reforms. And they will take time.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to everyone who's contributed to this session, which we need to conclude now. I think it's been a really stimulating and thought-provoking session. My takeaway from this is that we should do even more to get our messages out in ways that are going to reach everyone, not just our fellow academics or maybe the most powerful policymakers in the land, but also to get a really good conversation going across society on these really important issues which matter to everyone so much when they stumble upon them, because this can happen to you overnight, or something that creeps up on you, and it can be your daily reality for years, or something you have to cope with for short periods. But all of this is really important for general debate. So I'm going to thank everyone now for their contributions. Thanks to Matt, to Patrick, to Lizzie, and to Amy for great contributions, to Tom for very thought-provoking responses. And I hope that those who hear our presentation when it goes live in the conference will also respond to it and share their thoughts about what you've had to say. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, Sue.